So, aside from being one of my best friends, Dr. Sheffield is a paleontologist and assistant professor in the geosciences department at the University of South Florida. She received her bachelor's degree at UNC Chapel Hill, her master's at Auburn in geoscience, and her PhD in geoscience at the University of Tennessee. She studies ancient echinoderms, which, if you've not taken my class or Dr. Unger's invertebrate zoology class, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, those are starfish and crinoids. In addition to an active career in paleontological research, she is extremely active in the field of effective teaching methods, particularly for students interested in earth and environmental science. Along with a team of skilled communicators, she is a site collaborator for the Time Scavengers blog, which aims to provide the general public with a basic understanding of our most important geological concepts, like climate change and evolution. Her work in both research and outreach have been recognized with several grants and fellowships, including her induction as a Geological Society of America Fellow in 2020, a presidential citation for science and society by the American Geophysical Union, and an outreach and education grant through the Paleontological Society. Dr. Sheffield is here to speak with us today about best practices for making science as an enterprise more inclusive, which she argues starts in the classroom. The title of her talk is The Greats, in quotes, of Science, Who We Learn About and Why It Matters. Without further ado, Dr. Sheffield.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So yes, I've known Joy for almost 10 years. I was going to count it up and not say it, but then I did, so I'm so sorry. Almost 10 years now, where we started off as office mates at the University of Tennessee. So thank you to Joy for getting me through grad school. Don't think I could have done it otherwise. So I'm so excited to be here today. I'm really excited. So just so you know, I'm going to be running this a little bit like how I actually teach my classes. So I am very sorry if my students have forewarned you about how that's going to happen, but I promise it won't be too painful. I don't know how they would have known, but so I'm going to be talking to you and I'm going to be asking you questions. And like my classes, it's totally okay if it's chaos. I'm okay with it. You know, I feel like a good dose of chaos is always a good way to teach. So feel free to shout out, ask questions. I will literally be asking you to shout out at me and answer things. Hopefully you have a piece of paper and pen. If not, it's okay. You can just also list things in your head or in the chat. So we're going to be talking today about the greats of science, as Dr. Bongiorno said, who we learn about and why it matters. So I thought I would put a picture of the scientist that pretty much everybody thinks about whenever we see a scientist in our brain. We usually think of Albert Einstein. And you may not think the name Albert Einstein, but a number of scientific studies have actually shown that our brain automatically associates an older white man with crazy hair, usually doing something like writing equations on the board. So like our brain automatically associates scientist with the picture of Albert Einstein, whether or not you're thinking of his name. So I actually learned something really cool about Albert Einstein recently. I don't know how much you knew about this, but Dr. Einstein actually used to host Black singers in his house in New Jersey because he was so against the segregation policy. So he invited famous singers to stay with him when they weren't allowed to stay at hotels due to segregation laws during his time. So Dr. Einstein actually has a really interesting history outside of what we learned about science. So I encourage you to go check that out because I was really interested in learning more about that. All right, aside, let's continue. So we're going to play a game. And this game has no rules and no one will win. And I'm so sorry. So it's really less of a game than you just doing something. But let's name all the scientists that you learned about in your last science class. I don't care what science class, who did you learn about? Take the next 2 minutes or so and write some names down, or 1 minute, or however long you need. Start writing some names down. Who did you learn about? Last science class I took was 20. So I'm going to redact that number. Can't remember that long anyway. Anybody want to give me some names? Unmute, give me some names, or if you aren't a fan of talking in Zoom, feel free to add into the chat. Who did you learn about? Who was introduced in your classes?
My first thought was Rosalind Franklin.
Ah, Rosalind Franklin. Who else did you learn about?
We learned about Faraday.
What was that?
Faraday?
Faraday, very nice. Who else?
Anybody from 113 want to chime in about endosymbiosis?
I feel like it's cheating, but. So in my last class, it was a biogeography class. We talked about Charles Darwin. We talked about E.O. Wilson, talked about Alfred Wegener. Those are the three scientists that we really covered a lot of. Who else did you talk about?
We talked a little bit about Marie Curie.
Marie Curie.
In
Right.
psych, we're talking about Freud.
Freud, yeah. Freud actually got his, I don't know if you knew this or wanted to know this, but you're gonna now. Freud actually got his start in science dissecting eels. The more you know. Okay. So we learn about a lot of scientists. And if you go through a textbook, if you go through a biology textbook, if you go through a chemistry textbook, if you go through physics, astronomy, a lot of scientists have actually gone through these textbooks and counted who we talk about in science. And it's almost an 80 to 90% chance the scientist you're going to talk about is going to specifically fit one mold. All right. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that mold affects how we think about science and how we think about ourselves as scientists in a minute. But we're going to play another game. And this one is going to require you to holler out at me. Okay. Or type very loudly, whichever. Okay. So it literally says holler at me at the top. Who do you think about when you think about evolution?
Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin. Excellent. Got anybody else? Who do you think about? Okay. So I also think about Alfred Wegener, or not Alfred Wegener. What's wrong with me? Alfred Russel Wallace. My goodness, I wrote down the wrong name. Anyways, I think about Alfred Russel Wallace, who didn't get any credit pretty much for evolution. And I just took away even further by giving him another scientist entirely. So sorry, Alfred Russel Wallace. You think about anybody else? Who do you think about when you think about biology? Who comes to your head? It's okay if it's the same answer.
Mendel.
Mendel, right? Gregor Mendel, the guy who had too much time on his hands and spent a lot of time planting peas to see what colors they would be. Okay, who else? James Watson is usually really what Watson and Crick. Very nice. You beat me to it. Watson and Crick are two very famous examples. All right, Marie Curie. There we go. All right. Who do you think about when you think about paleontology? It is cheating if you say Sarah Sheffield. Who do you think about?
Worked with a guy named Sean.
You worked with a guy named Sean. Okay. It's okay if you say Jurassic Park. I won't love it, but it's okay. I know.
I was gonna say, is it problematic of me that my first thought was like Indiana Jones?
It's not. Indiana Jones. That's okay. So Indiana Jones, we can talk about the ethical implications of his actions later, but kidding.
Sue.
What was that?
Her last name? The Sue, the lady who found the T-Rex.
So it was actually, okay. So maybe Sue Kidwell, maybe, I can't remember who Sue was named after at this point. That's okay. Either way. What about Ross from Friends? That's usually a common example of a paleontologist, right? We associate that. It's my least favorite association, to be honest, but the one I get most often. Who do we think about when we think about physics?
Newton.
Newton. Okay, who else do we think about?
Einstein.
Einstein. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? What about geology? What do you think about? We don't teach too many famous geologists, and this might be a little bit of a harder one. So maybe we can call on Dr. Bongiorno. Who do you think about when you think of geology? Who did you learn about?
I do teach about Charles Lyell.
Charles Lyell, yeah, famous geologist. BFS with Darwin. I assume they never used the term BFF. All right, so I think maybe we've noticed a little bit of a common thread here. We named a couple of women scientists. Primarily, they were very famous ones that we've talked about very recently, so Marie Curie and Rosalind Franklin. Those are really the very famous ones that we talk about in our classrooms. And sometimes Marie Curie and Rosalind Franklin are the only women we talk about. Did you notice any other similarities? And feel free to holler or put in the chat. What other similarities might you have noticed?
European.
They're European or American, right? So we can sum that up as white. Very good. Anything else? That's okay if that's not.
I was going to say mainly like aristocratic or very well-educated individuals.
That's a super good point. So aristocratic, typically much higher class, right? Most of these examples were very much from higher class, right? Not all, but most. Very good. Awesome. So I put up this picture of the most famous geologists that we talk about. All right. So we've got Darwin, we've got James Hutton, we have Charles Lyell, we have Thomas Huxley, we have Alfred Russel Wallace, and up in the top right, we have Alfred Wegener. If anybody knows what he's famous for, it is continental drift. He published on it in the 1920s. All right. So we notice a very clear theme in this, right? A very clear theme of who is often featured in these classes. These are who we consider the greats. And we talk a lot about Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace because the theory of evolution helped us understand the theory of plate tectonics, so the founding theory of geology, really. But these are who we really talk about. If you go through a geology textbook, which is, of course, the field I'm most familiar with, and the one I spend the most time looking in textbooks about, but this is it. This is who we talk about. There are very few non-white men discussed in geology textbooks. Okay, so that's not super great, right? Maybe we see some problems with that. Okay, what do we notice? We already got there. Sorry, everybody. But this, among other things, one of the major problems here is this really reinforces the narrative of who belongs in science. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, but I know that's not who belongs in science. I know science belongs to everybody. But whether or not we can recognize that, it actually has a big difference in how we view the history of science and how we view who belongs today and the policies that we consider normal in science. And we're going to explore some of that today. So, the greats. And I'm going to give you a spoiler. I'm not a big fan of talking about the greats. I'm just really not, right? We usually only talk about the scientists who made the biggest contributions, right? It seems silly for us to say, well, we should just talk about the scientists who didn't, make any big contributions at all, right? Makes sense that we talk about these who named the founding theories and things like that. So what's the problem when we just focus on the greats, right? What's the problem? So let's actually look at some non-science examples to illustrate this point, because I think it'll help kind of make some stuff clear. So back in the early 1800s, there was a renaissance of sorts of classical music and composing and things like that. There were a ton of composers out there. Can you name some composers for me? It's okay if you can't. This is not a music class or lecture. Fun fact, I'm actually a failed music major before I switched to science. So maybe Bach, Mozart, the guy who wrote the music from Star Wars, Tchaikovsky, very nice, and spelled correctly, high five. All right, so these composers also have a very specific thread in common, don't they? white men. So let's talk about, I got ahead of myself, money. Let's talk about money, okay? So here we have money from the United Kingdom, okay? Do we see any threads here? The exact same thread that we were talking about this whole time. We have Charles Darwin in the bottom corner. We have Matthew Boulton and James Watts, who were inventors and architects. We have Adam Smith of Adam Smith's laissez-faire economics. We have J.M.W. Turner, who painted boats. I think he probably had a more sophisticated description of that, but he painted boats. So we see that these are all white guys, right? So for a long time, we had Elizabeth Fry on the money as well. Now, Elizabeth Fry, if you don't know anything about her, she was awesome, right? She was awesome. Born in the late 1700s, she was a massive movement, or she was a massive part of the movement of social reform in the United Kingdom, and specifically prison reform. You should definitely look her up if you don't know anything about her. But outside of the monarchy, which doesn't really count in this case, the United Kingdom has for a long time featured a number of famous Brits on their money. And with the exception of Elizabeth Fry, they've all been men, right? So in 2013, they said, we're going to move her off the rotation and we're going to put in somebody else. And it was going to be all men. So someone named Caroline Criado Perez, who wrote a really great book that I'm going to shamelessly plug here on the next slide. And she actually started a petition and said, honestly, no, we should really have some women on the, why aren't 50% of women on the money? If we're going to highlight famous Brits, then why aren't we doing a better job? Well, the Bank of the United Kingdom said, okay, has nothing to do with that. Has nothing to do with men and women. It's that you have to have broad name recognition, can't be controversial, not so important here, and they must have made long-lasting contributions that are universally recognized with enduring benefits. So Darwin can be on the money, but there really just weren't any women that had that same kind of broad name recognition. So what's the problem with that? Okay, so one, is it really fair to say that when women and people of color, and especially women of color, were banned from participating in lots of society throughout most of this time, right? Or then by that, I mean, they weren't really allowed to enter higher education. They certainly weren't allowed to enter many spaces. So Mary Anning is a really great example of this. Mary Anning is the first known woman paleontologist from the United Kingdom. And she found an incredible amount of fossils on the coasts of the United Kingdom. Some of the most famous swimming reptiles and things like that of all time. She went to the Geological Society of London, which is the premier hoity-toity society of the geologists even today. And she said, look at my awesome fossils. And they said, get out. She was not allowed even to enter the doors. They then took the fossils and presented on them and published them, but without her help, right? So her name was lost to history. So it makes it a little bit harder. But there's a second problem here. And the second is who gets the credit for things. And to do this, now we're going to talk about composers. Who do you think, when it comes to famous music composers, I was so excited I got way ahead of myself. So I'm just going to repeat everybody's answers here. Tchaikovsky, Bach, Mozart. We're going to think about this. And this example is highlighted in this awesome book called Invisible Women, data bias designed for a data bias in a world designed for men. Sorry, your faces were covering up the title. It is super good. So let's think about Felix Mendelssohn. This is a German composer from the 1800s, early to mid 1800s. Felix Mendelssohn was one of the most famous German composers at the time. He published many compositions of his original work. And by all intents and purposes, he was described as a piano virtuoso, very talented. Well, not too long ago, we started learning a little bit more about Fanny Hensel. Her maiden name was Mendelssohn. They were brother and sister. So Fanny was a little bit older than Felix, and a number of accounts, including the family diaries and other things, actually said that Fanny far outstripped his talent on the piano. And they were very fiercely competitive about it. And not too long after her death, they started noticing something about Felix's work. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. But Fanny really wanted to compose her own work. And due to society pressures and due to her family restrictions, she was not able to. So I'm going to read to you this quote from Felix Mendelssohn From my knowledge of Fanny, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for authorship, in this example, composing music. She is too much all that a woman ought to be for this. She regulates her house and neither thinks of the public nor the musical world, nor even of music at all until first duties are fulfilled. Publishing would only disturb her in these, and I cannot say I approve of it. So he says this long quote, right? Bunch of nonsense in my brain. And then it turns out he was actually using his sister's work as his own. Bunches of her compositions were some of his most famous works. He took them and published him while then saying, Fanny, she's not interested in composing. She's got lady stuff to do, right? She's got to do the family stuff. So up until 2018, which is the last time I saw any revisions, some of his work is now still being accredited to her. They've been looking at the musical patterns and finding her original notes and things like that. So Fanny, right before she died of a stroke unexpectedly, actually did break away from her family's influence. And she published, or she was about to publish, her very first piece. It was purchased by someone who was doing that to publish in a musical journal. Unfortunately, she died almost immediately after that. But she did actually publish at least one piece of her own under her name. So if we're talking about how we need to have universal name recognition, that's going to be a little bit harder, isn't it? If the work is literally being taken from someone and being attributed to someone else. And you're thinking, okay, well, I know you're not thinking this, but lots of people might be thinking, well, this is just one example. But it's not just one example. So now we're going to move back into the science world to talk about another example. And many of you already know the story of Rosalind Franklin and James Watson and Francis Crick. So we're not going to talk about that example because many of us already know it, where Rosalind Franklin really made that first discovery that made it possible for Watson and Crick to figure out the double helix structure. She didn't get any of the credit for it. James Watson then wrote a book about it. Didn't matter because Rosalind did not actually like being called Rosie, was too stupid to know her own data. That is a direct quote from the book, right? So we're going to talk about Marie Tharp instead, who was another hero in my mind. She was mapping the first rift valleys on the ocean floor. So this is in the 1950s. We have our first submarines kind of taking off. This is going to be the first direct evidence for plate tectonics. So plate tectonics, of course, Alfred Wegener came up with some of it. African and South American scholars actually published what Alfred Wegener said about 50 to 100 years before Wegener said anything. However, he did not cite them, which is an interesting thing to note as well here too. But Marie Tharp mapped the first valleys on the ocean floor, showing how seafloor spreading was actually happening. It had to do a lot with paleomagnetism. This is not my intro geology class, so don't worry, I will not continue this discussion here. So this is a huge find. Marie Tharp goes to her supervisor, Bruce Heezen at the time, and says, Bruce, I found some cool stuff. And Bruce literally said, this is girl talk. Direct quote, multiple sources. This is girl talk. He said, this can't be. It looks too much like continental drift. It's not real. So continental drift was dismissed as ridiculous at the time because how are these giant things floating, these giant continents just floating anywhere? Boo is right, person in the chat. Definitely boo. So how are these things floating? Doesn't make sense. Marie, this has got to be girl talk. All right. So it turns out that it wasn't girl talk, right? Plate tectonics is a very widely accepted theory in science, right? But Heezen, once he found evidence of earthquakes on those rifts, showing how the earth was actually shifting to accommodate this expansion of seafloor, he published the findings, and her name was not on the paper. She was left off of it entirely. Bruce Heezen was given almost all the credit, along with a couple other famous geologists like Henry Hess and Wilson, talking about the Wilson cycle, the birth and death of ocean basins, all dealing with seafloor spreading. So her name was left off of it. And for this entire time of the boon of science, after plate tectonics were really correctly identified, her name meant nothing. There was no mention of her whatsoever. After Heezen's death, Marie Tharp stood up and said, hello, everybody. I'm here to take credit for my work. It was awesome, right? And she gained the rightful notoriety that she deserved. But in science classes, who did we talk about? Who got credit for this work? Heason did. So Marie's name was really left off of this, which is a problem. Now we're going to talk about another great example, and one many of us have never heard of before. This is Vivian Thomas. And Vivian Thomas is an excellent example. So he was born during the Jim Crow era in Louisiana, right before about 10 years or so before the Great Depression. Vivian Thomas was extremely bright. So out of all his brothers and sisters, he really showed this extreme aptitude. His parents dreamed of him going to college. Unfortunately, due to the Great Depression, these plans were derailed, and he really loved medicine. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to go study to be a doctor. So at some point, his family moved to Tennessee, and he began working as a surgical resident, or a surgical assistant, at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. And he was working with a surgeon who hired him and said, "You seem pretty cool and eager to do this. Let's do this." However, at the time, we are dealing with Jim Crow era segregation. It was not something that was done to have a Black man as a surgical assistant. It just wasn't done. So he was listed as a janitor, and he was paid as a janitor. And there's absolutely no discussion here about why janitor work is not absolutely critical. Of course, in hospitals, it's even more critical, and we thank them for their work for keeping hospitals running. But he was a surgical assistant. He was not paid for his expertise, even though his work was so critical at the time. His supervisor, when he was given a hotshot job at Johns Hopkins, he said, "I can only go if Vivian Thomas comes with me. I will only go if Vivian comes." And some of Vivian's work so far had been actually working with crushing syndrome. So something that a lot of soldiers at the time in World War I and starting into World War II were coming home with. Crushing syndrome, after being crushed by something, it leaves a number of issues in the body. We won't get into that for now, but he actually made a lot of headway in saving thousands of lives during the war. So he was so successful, he said, no, he has to move to Johns Hopkins in Maryland with me. So he moved to Maryland, where by all accounts, he suffered even worse racism and discrimination, which is always something to think about when you're thinking about where racism occurs. It's not a Southern thing, which that's a very important point to make. It's everywhere. We can't just say, well, it's worse in one place than the other. And during this time, he spent he was tasked with solving what we call blue baby syndrome. And I'm going to talk about infant mortality. So if that's something you need to mute me for, please do. I'll give you a couple seconds to get that ready. So blue baby syndrome is where blood is shunted past the lungs, creating oxygen deprivation. So children can live with this for some time, but typically it is extremely fatal. So his supervisor told him, "I need you to develop a surgery to fix this." And so he did. So for the next couple of years, he spent days upon days, hours upon hours, all day working on procedures to fix the syndrome. And he started to successfully cure it in other animals. So he was curing in other animals. That's how he was developing the procedures. He developed his own tools, everything to fix this, particularly in dogs. And one day, someone came in. The Blue Baby is her new name. I can't remember her name officially right now, but she came in like a 2-year-old, and she had blue baby syndrome, and they operated on her. And they were actually able to extend her life. Now, Vivian Thomas was not allowed to do the surgery, seeing as he was not an official doctor. He was a surgical assistant without medical training officially. However, he had trained himself, of course, through all this time. But he was there the whole time showing his supervisor how to do the surgery, saying, no, you need that tool. No, you need this tool. So he directed the entire surgery, and they gave that girl months of her life back. And over time, he continued to direct the surgery, help develop tools to be used on humans, and it was published in a landmark case. And of course, you'll see Vivian Thomas's name here. Oh, wait, we don't see Vivian Thomas's name here. The credit was given to his supervisor, Alfred Bladlock, and a doctor at the time, Helen Tausing, who tasked them originally with coming up with the surgery. So even though he developed the entire surgery and he directed the first one, came up with the tools, his name was completely left out of it. So this is an incredibly famous story in medical science now, because blue baby syndrome is something that affects a number of infants. And now it is a very safe surgery that is performed very quickly. But Vivian Thomas's name was left out of it. And it's left out of a lot of the medical textbooks, including still today. So when we assign who's great, who are we actually assigning? We're assigning it to the folks who were able to participate. And we're assigning it to the people that at the time society deemed worthy of highlighting. So we're actively erasing who was actually participating in science, because we've all learned about Rosalind Franklin. We've learned about Marie Curie. We've learned about we've learned about George Washington Carver, right? The man who invented peanut butter, actually did quite a bit more than that. You should learn more about how he kept the South out of starvation for a couple of years. But we look back and we say, well, there weren't a whole lot of women, there weren't a whole lot of people of color, there weren't a lot of, Black folks participating in science throughout the years. That's why we don't learn that many. They were there. But what have we done but actively erase them? And when we do that, we continue to shape the stereotype of who looks like a scientist and who we continuously learn about. So this brings me to what I did in my classroom. So this is a famous example of a scientist. This is a famous example of a study done on children's psychology, where they asked kids in the 1980s, just draw a scientist. And this is who they all drew, like 95%. All right, they all drew this. It was a white guy, typically with poor safety standards, I'll say that much, standing at a table with some chemicals, probably some like really messy hair, as I said, kind of like Albert Einstein. Now, people still do this today. I've done this before. Actually, I believe Dr. Bondorno, was with me when I did this once. And we did it to a girls group, and all the girls drew pictures of themselves. And it was really embarrassing because I was up at the front absolutely blubbering, right? So some stereotypes are changing, but what's really interesting is we run this experiment on small kids and they're more diverse about their science. By the time they get to college, they actually revert back and they're all drawing white men again, because we continuously teach this limited version of who belongs in science. So kids actually begin and they see this beautiful world ahead of them. And then we teach them, no, it's this. It's the white man behind the desk with the beakers. So how do we fix this? All right. So this is where I came in. I got really tired of this kind of history, right? So in my classes, we talked about a couple different scientists. And so I ran a study where we interviewed students on their participation. And this is how I'm going to start this off. So Jessica, these are all pseudonyms here. None of these are real names. You cannot track their identities. Jessica said, so for the longest time in my head, a lot of scientists were old white men, right? That's a lot of the scientists that we've got in our heads today. So where is science now? Outside of the healthcare industry, which includes a lot of nurses and certified nursing assistants, healthcare overall is more women dominated, except from the doctor standpoint, unfortunately. Computer jobs, engineering jobs, physical life scientists, mathematics, and researchers, they're all male dominated, right? Now, marginalization is not just a gender thing. There's many, many, many axes of marginalization here. So if we take a look at race and ethnicity in STEM, we're not doing so great either. The only groups that are really overrepresented are white folks, and in very select fields of STEM, Asian or Asian American. However, this is aggregated for what we consider all Asia, not South Asia or Pacific Islander and other things. So this number is not actually accurate. All right, but we have not done a great job at breaking down the data. So where are we in the geosciences? Unfortunately, I hate to break this to you, geology is about the worst offender there is in terms of diversity in STEM. And this goes far beyond gender, race, and ethnicity. It also goes to LGBTQ plus representation in STEM, disability in STEM, low income and first generation in STEM. Geology is doing really badly, all right? And I'm gonna pick on geology. I am a geologist, I feel like I've earned that right. So a lack of diversity and inclusion is the single largest problem facing the geosciences today. And I am so sorry to interrupt really quickly. Can I get a reminder of when this talk ends?
1:15.
Perfect, thank you so much. All of a sudden I thought, what if it's 1? Thank you. Okay, so this is where the intervention scientist of the week comes in. All right, so this is an intervention I ran where each week we highlighted a scientist from a different background, living or dead, didn't really matter. We have scientists from Wanda Diaz Merced, she is up here in the top right corner. She is a blind astronomer who actually developed her own computer software so that she could hear the data coming in because there were no accommodations for her to come in to science. We have Wangari Maathai here, second down on the left. Wangari Maathai was one of the first women in East Africa to earn a Ph.D. in any field, and she actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, one of the only Black women ever to earn the Nobel Prize for the Green Belt movement, where she led millions of trees to being planted and lifted women out of poverty while doing so. So all kinds of people, to my friend Jen Bauer up in the top left, who's just awesome. She's an early career paleontologist, and we talked about how she runs Time Scavengers, a science communication blog. So all kinds of people, famous people, not so famous people, all kinds of situations here. And so again, why does inclusive representation actually matter? I feel like we've already answered this, right? And we don't want to go back to the slide where we're just looking at a bunch of these dudes here. So let's move on to this one, which this represents the science that I want to learn more about. So if you look here, on the bottom, second from the right, that's Caroline Solomon. She is a deaf scientist at Gallaudet University, the only fully deaf institution in the United States, who gives really excellent talks on why being deaf gives her a completely different perspective of what science is. So this is really the science we want to talk about, all of these different perspectives that gives science the dimensionality that we need to continue to build a great community. So we form these stereotypes in science when we don't have this representation. And here's a great example. Here are a couple pictures of me in the field. You may not be able to tell, but in both of these pictures, I am covered in head to toe in dirt, like in my ears everywhere, dirt everywhere, right? So on the left, I am in Spain, and on the right, I am on the side of a mountain in Sardinia. We just managed to coax some goats out of our field site and said, please God, stop pooping on the fossils, right? So geology is a weird science. You know, a lot of geology can be done in the field. That's another stereotype. It's not all done in the field, but a lot of it can be. However, there's some really strict stereotypes about who gets to participate in field science. So I found this great paper from Fairchild et al. 2021, and I'm not going to read both of these out loud to you entirely, but from a faculty member, I get to be outside all the time, and it's primarily the males that have this attitude about geology. From a student, you can get dirty doing lab work or field research, and that's not an interest to some ladies out there. They'd rather do nursing, help people. So these folks came in with these ideas about who gets to participate and who should participate. And sure, duh, they're wrong, you know. My dress shoes from the conference I'm at are currently so covered in mud I can't find them because I just went out and did field work in the middle of the day instead of going to my conference talk. I'm joking, I went to the conference, it's afterwards. All right. But when we have these ideas, they perpetuate stereotypes that make it really hard for folks to come in and participate in science, down to comments like, oh, careful, you don't want to break a nail, down to which students are chosen to go out into the field with professors, right? So this makes a huge difference. So now we can ask ourselves, in what ways does implementing an in-class diversity intervention impact student perceptions of science and scientists? So we asked a bunch of students in my class, how did you feel about implementing this session? So we contacted 30 students, which is a whole huge number of students when we're talking about qualitative data. About 14% participated. And we coded the interviews. This is not computer coding, this is qualitative coding, which is a really different way to wrap my brain around things. I had adult supervision with folks who are qualitative coders in their real life, and they worked with me to develop these methods. It's always important that you work with experts in the field that the research is being done in. So USF is a large institution. It has about 50,000 students in total. It is gigantic. We're like our own little city, and we have some pretty broad racial and ethnic and gender diversity here. So to understand how students were going to be responding to this, we have 3 theoretical frameworks that really drive the research questions. The first is the nature of science, and the nature of science just means science is a human construct, meaning it's influenced by science, or it's influenced by humans. The questions we ask, the biases we have coming into science, those are driven and shaped by humans. We have the stereotypical images of science. This is something that's been developed for the past 60 so years, where folks think of white men as scientists. That's the stereotypical image that's been mindset across the globe. And self-concept. Self-concept means that folks' perceptions of themselves are influenced by their environment. For example, when someone tells women that women aren't so good at math, women tend to perform more poorly in math. This happens in classrooms, K through 12 classrooms to girls all over the world. When we tell kids that they're great at something, guess what? They end up actually being really good at things. So your self-concept is perceived by your environment. And I'll give you some quotes here, summary quotes to examine all of these here. So the first one is K through 12 education. When we learn about scientists, they're usually white, male, and rich, the three things that you told me. Very little do we find out about anyone outside of that bubble. Again, these are pseudonyms, so pray tell is not the actual name here. New conceptions, recognition of scientists outside of their career, right? So thinking about broadening that expansion here. So for example, Laura said there were women who were contributing at the time, but not being recognized for that work. That's really eye-opening to me. They talked later about how it changed their interpretations of who was being discussed. And then science identity. So how did students themselves view themselves personally outside of their career and education? How did this change how they felt about being a scientist? So with some of these quotes here, Josh said, I know we talked about a queer scientist. I'm queer, so that's a connection. Josh later talked about how he had no idea of the history of folks participating in science from the LGBTQ plus community. And Jessica said, I would actually say this made me change my major to being a scientist. So actually talking about these scientists influenced this to make students see how they could fit into the science culture and see how they could be participating in science. So some of the quotes that really struck me were some by Sam Porter. Some of them I remember being people of color, and sometimes people that weren't coming to this country or weren't from this country coming to work into this country, which I can relate to myself and really motivated me to strive for bigger things. So by introducing these scientists, Sam Porter, who later also tells us he is an immigrant from this country, from somewhere in South America, this actually broadened his ability to see how he could work in Spanish and English to do his science. Jessica says, I could truly begin to see myself in their shoes, where I guess I am a scientist. It broadened their position of who was allowed to call themselves a scientist. I remember one of the scientists had autism. I thought that was cool because I'd never heard that before. Alex later identifies as autistic in the anonymous survey. Sam Porter talked about how the work of Mary Anning, it really influenced his idea on who was given credit and how these early pioneers in the field really opened it up for women later on. I want to point this out is that even though we did this, obviously there's still persisting gender stereotypes. So Jessica said a little bit later when we were talking about like science communication, how cool it was for boys who love dinosaurs. Now this one's personal, right? This one's personal because my office looks like, you know, what the Hobby Lobby thinks that a 6-year-old boy's bedroom should look like. Right? There's dinosaurs everywhere. So it's really hard to get stuff that's not coded for boys, right? If you go to the any birthday card section, it's all boy stuff. If there's dinosaurs on it, and usually fairies and princesses, and pink if it's girls, right? So we still have these stereotypes really deeply ingrained into our brain. So we need to continue to think about how we can break this up. So to conclude here, this intervention actually shifted folks' ability to think of who a scientist was, to understand the broader conception of who a scientist can be, and understanding the barriers and the actual history in place for folks with scientists with marginalized identities. So we need to continue doing this. We need to introduce this in all of our classes because we're teaching future teachers. We're teaching folks who are going out and running our government, running our world, and we need to break these stereotypes. And this quote here is just, it sums up everything that I really wanted to. Scientists don't always look like what you think they look like. They're not always lab coats with a bigger kind of scientists. They're scientists of all different hues and shapes and varieties. This is the quote that really kind of summed up the whole point of what I do and the recent subject of the paper that I wrote on this. And with that, Please make sure to listen to the recommendations of scientists with marginalized identities, listen to experiences, right? You may share some of these marginalized identities. Go out there and tell people, hey, I'm a scientist, I'm awesome, continue being awesome. If you don't have these marginalized identities, listen, see what will help. Ask questions about what you can do to improve the culture of STEM and make these changes. Work with your faculty, go be faculty, right? All of you have that power if you want it. So be mindful of representation. It's a necessary step towards equality, but it doesn't end there. Just because we have inclusive representation doesn't mean we're done with the work. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all the scientists who have allowed me to talk about them in class, and all the students who participated, and my co-authors, and some funding sources here. This was IRB exempt, meaning that it is ethical research on humans, if you hadn't heard that term before. Thank you so much, and I enjoyed getting the chance to speak with you.
All right, everybody give Dr. Sheffield a big thank you. We really appreciate her time today. And I know that was quiet, everybody's muted. It's unfortunate, but we want to go ahead and open it up for questions, thoughts, concerns, additional solutions. Anybody have any thoughts or specific questions for Dr. Sheffield?
I had a question. Considering the talk of like textbooks only showing a lot of those predominantly white males, why do you think textbooks continue to do that?
The people who are writing textbooks are typically white men still. And this isn't on purpose. It's not like the folks out there today are going out there saying, yeah, I'm only going to show these pictures. But who do you think they picture when they see the important scientist? They picture the white men. So there's a really great paper, I think, that really kind of shows that clearly. Is they did a study on skin tone representation in dermatology textbooks, where they didn't use non-white skin to show skin cancer. Black folks and other folks of color are often at higher risk for very dangerous types of skin cancer because it's not diagnosed as quickly. A lot of doctors were like, well, Black folks seem to be more susceptible to dangerous types of skin cancer. No, it's just diagnosed later. And the reason is that doctors are not as familiar with looking at it. The people who made these textbooks didn't set out to say, we're going to do this on purpose. It's just in their brain. It was a stereotyped image of what should go in there. And that's dangerous, right? So when we have that stereotype in our brain, it can actually be incredibly dangerous. We're painting a very specific field of what should be while excluding what actually is. So it's always a really good thing to think about. Thank you for asking that. It's a great question.
Something I was wondering about, you talked about developing biases, and I know there's a decent amount of research around as far as like developing and breaking bad habits, but is there anything as far as biases, like how long it takes to develop versus get rid of an implicit bias towards something else?
I don't know for sure, but I know that it can take a lot to break it. It really can. So I'm not perfect. I am just as flawed. Like, I've been exposed to the same societal standards and stereotypes that everyone else in this room has been. So my brain will still automatically associate things or, think things immediately that I'm like, no, wait a minute, that's not right. Right. So I always have to be conscious of it myself and correct myself and make sure, listen, let me look back at these slides. Like, what is the representation? Who have I shown here? So I always have to do it too. I think that's the biggest thing there is if you can put that little reminder in there, it will slowly start to break it, but it's certainly going to take a lot longer to break down those biases because we're dealing with decades of media. We're dealing with decades of reading books and things like that we need to make sure that we shift, become more inclusive.